Hi everybody, Bill Prince here. Welcome to our discussion of strict liability and product liability, a material that's contained in Chapter 13 of your text. You may recall that in our last discussion on the law of torts, we talked a lot about negligence. And if you recall, when we talked about negligence, we talked about businesses or individuals being responsible to others due to some failure in their conduct. In other words, somebody owed a duty to somebody breached that duty, and as a result of the breach of that duty, somebody was injured or out of pocket. When we look at strict liability and product liability, we're looking at sort of another branch of tort law, but as we will see, the burden of proof is quite a bit different. When we look at strict liability, we're looking at liability regardless of fault. So we're not concerned about negligence, we're not necessarily concerned about duty and causation and things of that nature. So we're talking about people who are engaging in certain kinds of behavior or doing certain kinds of things, which by the very nature of that behavior or the nature of those things create that liability in the event that there's any harm that is done. One of the areas in that is what is known as abnormally dangerous activities. And if you read the old case law, one of the ancient abnormally dangerous activities that are always talked about is the idea of collecting water on one's property. So, in other words, if somebody has a stream or something like that running through their property and they dam it up to create a pond or a reservoir of some type, that has always been viewed as a dangerous activity. So if, for example, the dam breaks, causing flooding to neighboring property, that individual who dammed the property is probably going to be responsible regardless of whether or not they were 100% cautious or not. It was just one of those dangerous activities. So what they look at is there a serious potential harm to persons or property by that activity? And again, collecting water was always viewed that way. Does it involve a high degree of risk that cannot be completely guarded against by the exercise of reasonable care? Again, damming water was one of those activities. And it's not commonly performed in the community or under the circumstances. So again, if you're damming property on or damming water on your property for a pond or a lake, whatever the purpose, that may not be something that's commonly done in one's neighborhood or community, and you're going to be responsible for that activity. Other things would be like having a dynamite factory on your property, having a nuclear reactor on your property. Those are just activities that are so dangerous that if anything bad happens, you are probably going to be on the hook, regardless of whether or not you were negligent or not. Another area where strict liability can occur is with animals. So somebody who keeps wild animals is strictly liable for any harm that animal inflicts. So again, if you're a dairy farmer and you have cows or chickens or things like that, and that cow or chicken somehow injures somebody, more likely than not, you're not going to be held responsible for that unless you had some reason to know that cow or chicken was particularly dangerous. On the other hand, if you're keeping lions and tigers and bears or cobras or some other kind of wild animal on your property, and that animal injures somebody, then you are probably going to be responsible whether or not you took due care to take care of keeping that animal on your property or not. So, think about places like Exotic Animal Paradise, which, sits to the kind of the east of town here, where they keep animals like that. If one of those critters were to get out or harm somebody, strict liability would more likely apply. In addition to abnormally dangerous activities and wild animals, there are certain kinds of product liability where strict liability exists. And product liability is a manufacturer's, seller's, or lessor's liability to consumers, users, and bystanders for physical harm or property damage that is caused by the goods that they produced and sold. And as you can see here, product liability is based on these two factors. These are the philosophies that underlie that. That the manufacturer can better bear the cost of injury because it can spread the cost throughout society by increasing the price of its stock, which of course falls back on the consumers ultimately. And the manufacturer is making a profit from these activities and therefore should bear the cost of injury as an operating expense. So when you have people manufacturing automobiles, pieces of machinery, and things of that nature, kind of the underlying philosophy of this product liability law is again that in the event that there is harm caused by that product, the manufacturer is in a better position to deal with that than the person who was actually harmed. We talked a little bit about negligence, and there can be negligence in product liability. So a manufacturer is liable for its failure to exercise due care to any person who sustained an injury proximately caused by the manufacturer's negligence. So here again, we're kind of looking at traditional traditional tort law when we look at product liability in this case. And so again, if somebody manufactures a product and in the course of designing it or producing it causes injuries to people, that company can be responsible if there was negligence in designing the product, if there was negligence in using like shoddy materials in producing the product, if there was some sort of flaw in the manufacturing process itself, if there was failure to assemble or test the product, think of pharmaceuticals, or if there were some known risks to the product after manufacturing it, the failure to put those risks on a warning label of some type or to inform the user of those potential risks, they can be responsible. So think about all the products that you buy anymore and the page after page of adequate warnings, which most of us never read. Again, that is to deal with some of these issues created by this area of the law. In some cases, regardless of negligence, a manufacturer, seller, or lessor of goods is going to be liable regardless of intent or the exercise of reasonable care for any personal injury or property damages to consumers, users, and bystanders caused by the goods if the manufacturer sells or leases if the product is defective when the defendant sells it, either to an end user or another seller for ultimate resale. We see this a lot in like car manufacturing, where one company manufactures a defective part that is later sold to Ford, say, and then Ford utilizes that in the manufacture of its car, and the defendant is normally engaged in the selling or otherwise distributing of the product in question. So if there's some sort of sprocket or something like that is defective when it's manufactured and sold to Ford, and then Ford puts it into its car, then potentially you've got liability both on the part of the manufacturer and of Ford. If the product is, let's go back here for a minute because we're still reading some things. So strict liability is also going to exist, again, in addition to these two factors. Also, if the product is unreasonably dangerous to the user or consumer because of its defective condition. So the fact that this product was designed poorly or manufactured poorly, if it creates an unreasonable danger, strict liability may lie. The plaintiff has to suffer physical harm to self or property as a result of using the product. The defective condition causes the plaintiff's harm, so there has to be some relationship between the defective product and the injury suffered by the plaintiff. And the product has not been substantially changed between the time the defendant sold or otherwise distributed it and the time the plaintiff was injured. So again, the company has some protection, if somebody alters its product and makes it unreasonably dangerous after it has been sold. So that could be a defense to them as well. Here's a definition of what an unreasonably dangerous product is. And I guess if you think about it, anything could be an unreasonably dangerous product, from this microphone I'm using to the lamp that's lighting my room. But again, there has to be some limits, obviously. We can all use a product in such a way that could create harm. The question becomes is what responsibility does the manufacturer have? An unreasonably dangerous product is a product that is so defective as to threaten a consumer's health and safety, either because the product is dangerous beyond the expectation of the ordinary consumer, or the manufacturer failed to produce an economically feasible, less dangerous alternative. And think of the situation where a number of years ago, I think it was General Motors, made a product, and we may have talked about this already. It was one of their pickup trucks, and they had what were called saddlebag gas tanks, which basically had gas tanks under both the passenger side and the driver's side of a truck, and these were particularly susceptible to blowing up in the event that the vehicle was T-boned. So if you're coming through an intersection and another car came through and hit you, there was a pretty good reasonable chance that those tanks would blow up. And in one case they did, and injured and killed some folks. And in one of the biggest product liability cases and damage awards ever, General Motors was hit hard because they realized that these tanks and the way they were manufactured and placed, again, created this. They were much beyond the expectation of the ordinary consumer in terms of dangerousness, and it was determined that really, with some small, very inexpensive alterations, the tanks could have been rendered much safer. So that was a situation where General Motors was whammed because they did not come up with a less dangerous alternative, which was shown to have existed. Claims that a product is unreasonably dangerous generally fall into one of these three categories. A manufacturing flaw, that in manufacturing it, the manufacturer failed to test the product, that the product itself was designed poorly, or that there was inadequate warning given. So the product was designed fine, it was manufactured okay, but even so, there were certain dangers that consumers needed to be aware of, and there was a failure on the part of the manufacturer and seller to notify the consumer of that danger. And so I've put some examples of unreasonably dangerous products, things like firearms, alcohol, machinery, tools, cars, pharmaceutical products, tobacco. Those are the kinds of things that fall into these strict liability cases. All right, manufacturing defects. If the manufacturer, wholesaler, and retailer are strictly liable when the product departs from its intended design, even though all possible care was exercised in preparation and marketing of the product. So again, the thing was just dangerous from the inception, and was just they manufactured it wrong. Design defects is where the product is designed. Before it's in the factory, it's bad on paper, and again, if a plaintiff can show that the defendant could have avoided the foreseeable risk of harm by designing it in some other way, they are going to get whacked probably by a jury. Okay, let's see. Warning defects. A warning is defective if the foreseeable risks of harm posed by a product could have been reduced or avoided by providing reasonable warnings or instructions, and omitting the warnings or instructions render the product not reasonably safe. So, this kind of gets into the issue of personal responsibility versus corporate responsibility. Again, if you buy a ladder, it pretty clearly says on most ladders, don't stand on that top rung because it's unstable and you're going to fall. If the ladder company failed to put that warning on there, then they could potentially be responsible for somebody's own stupidity in standing on a ladder, the top rung of a ladder. If there's obvious risks, there's no duty to warn about those. But again, the stupidity of mankind sometimes knows no bounds, and we see relatively innocuous products often used in wrong ways that result in harm. And then, of course, the natural inclination is to sue because the product caused harm even though it was used poorly. I think about the case involving a couple who had a young baby, tiny. I think it was probably under a month or two old, and they fed it peanut butter. And needless to say, babies can't chew or swallow peanut butter, and unfortunately the child died. And the people sued the peanut butter manufacturer because there was nothing on the jar saying don't feed peanut butter to a baby. Now, most people would think that was an obvious risk, but again, when you're in the world of manufacturing and production, you really have to be defensive in terms of protecting yourself. And so, what is an obvious risk to some people may not be obvious to another. All right, I'm going to skip market share liability there. That really gets pretty complicated, but this is the idea where if a product is sold, and you're really not sure where the where the fault lie, whether it was in design, manufacture, production, whatever, that all firms in that chain can be held responsible for a portion of the responsibility. All right, well, what are some of the defenses to this strict liability? And then there aren't very many. One is assumption of the risk, and that, again, if you can show that the plaintiff knew and appreciated the risk created by the alleged product defect. Even if you bought a product and knew it was faulty, but used it anyway, you could be held to have assumed the risk. If the product is misused, so if the defendant can show that the plaintiff was using the product in some way for which it was not designed, i.e., feeding peanut butter to a baby, and the misuse was not reasonably foreseeable, then the defendant may avoid liability. It's that reasonably foreseeable part that is hard, because hindsight is 20/20, and if you look backwards, everything is reasonably foreseeable. The question is looking forward and trying to anticipate the misuses of a product, and if that misuse was not reasonably foreseeable, then the defendant may well avoid liability. And then we had, of course, comparative negligence, which, remember, we talked about when we talked about tort law, and that's the idea that the injury, so to speak, is divided between the fault of the manufacturer and the fault of the user. And then a couple others: common known danger. So if you can show that the plaintiff's injury resulted from a danger so commonly known by the general public that the defendant had no warning or duty to warn the plaintiff. So again, most of us know don't just stand on the top of a ladder. But again, some people are going to do that. And then the knowledgeable user. So if somebody has bought a tool or a piece of machinery for some sort of specified craft, and this user, is well aware of the ins and outs of this equipment and is an expert, so to speak, then you may not need to warn them. Okay, don't need to talk about that. So, a very brief discussion of product liability. We will meet you again in Chapter 15, I believe, when we're going to start talking about some internet law. So, have a great day, and we'll talk to you soon.